So tell us a bit about yourself, Nathalie.
So I am someone who specializes in psychology, technology, and human behavior, and I help business leaders to understand and harness the dynamics driving consumer and employee motivations, expectations, trends. And the idea really is to use behavioral science principles and practices to help people to better understand one another and to future-proof their businesses, and to hopefully encourage people to do better at business, to work in service of people and planet and not just profit. Yeah.
That's a beautiful dovetail into the next question that I have. I think behavior science is, in very much front center right up there in the current ecosphere and the zeitgeist. Do you think it should be actually a mandatory subject in K-12 curriculums, considering the importance and the significance?
That's such a good question. I think education is key when we're talking about any kind of resilience when it comes to future uncertainty and the career landscape that's going to change very rapidly. So I think when we're thinking about the skills that are most important and least replicable in some ways by AI, we have to look at human capacities such as creativity, such as imagination, our ability to relate to one another. And I think when you start looking at these deeper qualities, the behavioral sciences as well as the arts become absolutely vital in helping us to get to know ourselves better, one another better, and then to be able to adapt to uncertainty with greater responsiveness. So I think behavioral sciences are very important for young folks, and I think the arts as well are increasingly important.
So catch them young is your advice.
And I think also start them young, and especially because a lot of this stuff, it gives us a sense of insight as to why we behave the way that we do. So, whenever you read the books or you listen to the podcast or people listen to your podcast about lifting the lid on human behavior, it's as much to understand ourselves as to understand other people. So I think there's something there also about self-knowledge, self-compassion that then extends out, which people don't really talk about so much in the behavioral science space. But I think that's also really important to use it to help us develop our, as some people might call it, the better angels of our nature.
Absolutely. Your work is at the crossroads, or so much at the intersection of persuasive technology, ethics, and online behavior. So as you do that, I'm sure you're, also engaging with pulls and pressures. Would you want to talk something about it?
Sure, and thanks for asking, because few people do. It's a tricky one, and it's a question which I think about quite a lot, and I know that I speak about in conversation with peers of mine who work in the space. For me, there's always the question of how the principles that we teach are being used, and what are the frameworks to ensure that they're being deployed in a way that are facilitatory and not coercive, because it's a very fine line. And we've seen
absolutely
with Cambridge Analytica scandals back in 2012 and since, and the Facebook psychometric kind of like newsfeed tests that they've done, etc. It's very easy, even though the results may be small, although significant, it's very easy to use these things and manipulate people with them. And so my perspective is, and I have quite a strong opinion about this, if we're going to be using behavioral science practices, and this leads back into your question at the beginning, how do we use them in such a way that's ethical, but also assumes the importance of everyone having this knowledge? So taking them away from just being, behind big paywalls that no one can afford to access what's often publicly funded research because of the journal system that's set up. So it's a question of understanding what these are, having more of a common discourse around behavioral science principles, how they're used, having an ethical framework around it, often having legal frameworks around it. So for instance, in the Netherlands, they were one of the first countries to rein in what some of the big kind of comparison holiday sites were doing to nudge people towards specific purchases. So like it's having that conversation around education, ethical practice, and legislation to make sure that behavioral science practices are used in a facilitatory way and not in a way that coerces. But again, this is an ongoing conversation that we need to be having in the light, because like anything, if you understand how to shape behavior, with that comes a great responsibility to steward people and not force or coerce them. What are your thoughts on that? So I'm intrigued from your perspective.
Yeah, actually, in fact, my thoughts is coming in the form of my next question, because you actually set the tone beautifully there, because brand authenticity or, and online behavior I just wanted to ask you in response to that, very valued insight that you shared. Do the twain meet, actually? I mean, are they birds of the same feather? Because it looks so diverse, right?
Yeah. Well, I think increasingly, as we've seen with the pandemic, brands are having to conduct all sorts of their business online. So whether that's deciding, how to deal with huge numbers of people getting in touch with customer service requests through bots or through human interaction, or whether it's pairing up with brand influencers that share your values. I think brand authenticity is absolutely key for the success of any business, increasingly so, especially when you look at Gen Z and millennial consumers coming up who are now entering the workforce. I mean, millennials have been in the workforce for a long time, but the things that drive them, it's all about primarily sustainability, social justice, making sure that we have good diversity, equity, and inclusion principles and practices in play, making sure that you're standing up for wrongs that are being, played out in the ecological sphere, in the economics. So this generation, these two generations, are extremely clued up on this. And so whether you're talking about online interactions and behavior or offline, they're so enmeshed now that the common thread really is how brands show up across all channels, in all domains, with integrity, and being able to enact the values that they say that they espouse. So I think they absolutely do meet, and it's vital that brands have a good sense of what their values are in order to be able to be consistent across those different channels.
I think just extending that thought, it is said now, and it is proven rather, that doing good is doing great for brands.
Yeah, that's
right,
a great way to sum it up.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So you are now 2 books young, right? Webs of Influence, The Psychology of Online Persuasion, and your recent book, Business Unusual. So just travel back a little bit in time and tell us what inspired you to actually become an author. Was it brewing over a period of time? Was it a flash trigger? You had a eureka moment? How did it actually brew? How did it all come about?
Well, I never really had much of an intention to become an author, which is a bit odd, I guess. I think the initial spark was because I was interested in how virtual environments shape behavior, and I hadn't found any further education that even remotely broached the subject in a complete way that I was looking for. So back in 2010, 2011, when I started looking into this, UX wasn't yet a field. You had this brilliant field of human-computer interaction, which was doing amazing work, but getting very little press. And then separately, you had the behavioral sciences, psychology, sociology, the cultural sciences. But there was not so much kind of linking everything together. And it was more a sense of, I guess, naivety, hubris, and desire to see something that would meet my questions and give me some answers that drove me to, write the first book. And it was a question of, well, how hard can it be? I'll just research and write a book that I would like to read. And as many first-time authors might sort of tell you, the initial excitement and idea quickly seeds ground to the actual reality of the amount of work that's going to have to go into it, especially when it's something that's based in science, which is such a fast-moving field. So the idea really was, how do I create something which is scientifically robust, that's clear that people can look at the references, so as things change, they know what the primary source material is, but it's delivered in a way that is empowering to the reader, that's clear, and that hopefully gives them practical advice on what to do with the research. So that was really kind of my hope for the first book. Yeah.
Okay, your second one, the new one, Business Unusual, I think probably is all the premise for a sequel or series of sequels. Considering that probably the only thing that is certain is uncertainty. Okay. What do you have to say to that? Is there something brewing in your head in terms of, because as you mentioned in the previous answer response, that things are changing so fast in this area of science that you need to be kind of agile and alert all the time, right? Because thoughts and mindsets could become obsolete for no fault of anyone.
Yeah. So in terms of it as a series, I mean, it's interesting you asked that, because I haven't really thought about the next book. It's one of these things that, because it's such a grueling, for me at least, it's such a grueling process and such an intense process, that it takes me a while once I've finished a book to forget how difficult it was, and then be inspired to write about something new. So I think it's something which, as a subject, I completely agree. It's got so much scope for revisiting how we address uncertainty, what the consumer behaviors and motivations of people in the workplace and beyond are going to be in 5 years' time, especially as we deal with resource depletion, ecological crises. You've got the economic issues that are going to come from coronavirus and lots of people losing their jobs. I mean, there's going to be a lot of change. And so I think it's probably something which could easily be revisited. Let's see what happens. I've got no desire in this moment to write a new book, but this will change, I'm sure.
Yeah, soak it in, I'm sure, because the title itself lends itself to, the title is the only thing that is insular, business unusual, because that is going to be the way of the future. We are never going to see something like business as usual, right? So business unusual is actually a future-proof title, so to speak. So in fact, my motivation, my inspiration to ask you that question was based on that. So good luck. I'm sure it'll let it through. For the time being, soak it in. So, I'm sure with both these books, you've done extensive research. There is a lot of hard work, toil, midnight oil being burnt and what have you that has gone in. Would you want to share with us what are the things that really stood out, both as shocks, pleasant surprises, great learnings? What would you have to say to that? What is the accumulation of your thoughts there?
So I think some of the things I found really interesting in the research was actually I came out of it with a lot more hope than I went in. And one of the reasons that I wrote Business Unusual was several reasons, but one of them was because we have to do things differently if we're going to have a flourishing future. That's very clear. And I think that businesses have this extraordinary power to be able to make change rapidly, at scale, and in a way that will impact a lot of lives. Because governments, as well-hearted as many people are in government, and there are many good-hearted people in government, despite what you read in the press, it's a very slow and lumbering beast in most cases. And so when I was doing the research, and I was thinking, okay, what can I do to be persuasive in terms of my argument for adopting a more values-driven, human and people and planet-centric approach that looks at meaning, that looks at purpose, that looks at doing something a bit deeper? I was looking for examples of brands and businesses that had done this successfully and also financially been able to thrive, because obviously there has to be that intersection, right? And I was really delighted that I was able to find a lot of examples of this. A lot of the people that I interviewed were very forthcoming and optimistic in terms of the change that they'd seen. And to me, it shows that there's a huge amount of potential that we're already seeing coming to fruition now of these ideas of people who've been plugging away for decades, many of them, whether it's in activist circles or, those thought leaders that are just seen as quite wild out there, talking about, like the founder of Patagonia, talking about people, planet, and purpose. We're starting to see this resonate throughout the business world. And one of the quotes that I'd love to share is from John Featherby, who was the founder of Shawmount, still is the founder of Shawmount, which is one of the UK's founding B Corp companies. And he said, and this really struck me, it's easy to forget that it was literally only 2 or 3 years ago that we were being laughed out of corporate meeting rooms, talking about things like purpose and meaningful work. It becomes mainstream because enough people talk about it, and it creates social permission. And then it becomes socially accepted, and then it becomes socially expected. And that beautifully captures the biggest learning that I took away in my research for the book, which is we're now in a place where we can have profound impact at scale, and people are willing to really take this on and do something meaningful with their leadership. So yeah, that's what I took as like the primary jewel from the research for the book.
Absolutely, hit the nail on the head, because I think it's moved on from being just a conversation piece, a lip service, to being a compelling strategic need, a compelling necessity. Yes. And I think the likes of P&G, profitability with purpose, and even Paul Polman before he retired from Unilever. If you look at all those examples, or actually, you can combine both. It is not a trade-off.
Right. Exactly. And in fact, as you look at the staples of brands that are doing best, often it's the sustainable brands that are doing better. and that have actually outperformed the others during COVID crisis, when a lot of people economically have been very pressured. People have less money to spend, many of them, and yet what we thought might happen, which is to spend less and go for the easy option, a lot of people, especially younger cohorts, have become a lot more committed to living up to their values. So it's people think that there's kind of this idea that we're always going to go for the easy option, the convenient option, the cheaper option. And of course, that dynamic is at play. We're all human after all. But there are other more profound dynamics at play that show up, like you say, with the sustainable brands that are proving to be very attractive and show that kind of long-term resilience that a lot of people questioned might be possible in such conditions.
Yeah, resilience, and God bless you all. I think the fairer sex, the women gender, have loads and loads of it, and that's why you guys are from Venus. So so it segues into my next ask, which is, you don multiple hats. You're a consultant, speaker, author, podcast host. It's obviously asking a mother which is her favorite child. So forgive me for that. So which is something that you enjoy doing the most?
Well, I love being in conversation with people. So this kind of conversation with you is just a real joy. And I think all the work that I do with the researching, with the book and the talking, it's kind of to facilitate conversations like this where we can have deeper questions to ask and I can learn. Like, one of the things that I most enjoy is learning. And the ways that I most enjoy learning is in conversation, asking questions, getting answers that I didn't expect, being challenged. Like, it's this kind of cognitive friction that comes with learning something new, or by someone standing up and saying, oh, I didn't quite agree with that. What about this? And so I think for me, the pursuit of knowledge, seeing how things connect, understanding people's passions, the ways in which they're changing the world, all of that stuff is the kind of stuff that really ignites me. And I think I find most of that most present in the podcasting, in the conversation. So I think in terms of joy, the conversational podcasting side of things and the interviewing side of things is what I find most enriching and enlivening. But of course, I wouldn't be able to do that so much if I wasn't doing all the heavy lifting for the book. So they are interconnected, but yeah, that's how I'd answer that one.
So you mentioned about learning, which is such a critical thing, because I think, as a quote in Buddhism, you need to have a beginner's mindset. So that you're constantly curious, satisfied in being dissatisfied, because your curiosity gets the better of you. That's why you want to know more, understand more. So society expects us to be, having a point of view all the time, right? POV, for want of a better acronym. And so I was looking at it from a slightly different point of view, that a POV could also be a point of vulnerability. Okay, wherein you can open up and listen, and I don't need to do everything. I can't know everything. Those three words are very, very important, as I don't know. So you can tell it to me, because there are somebody else who's wanting to share it with you, right? You're open, you're receptive. So I feel that, yes, having that sense of learning, that curiosity, that you cannot know it all. This is exactly what I think Satya Nadella, when he took over as CEO of Microsoft, mentioned to his team. So Microsoft had this aura of know-it-all. Okay. And he actually wrote on the conference room whiteboard, his first meeting with all the senior leadership. We moved from a know-it-all company to a learn-it-all organization.
Brilliant. But that really hits nail on the head, doesn't it? It's that kind of that learner's mindset.
Absolutely. The curiosity, the beginner's mindset. So, I heard this from, I think, Brian Chesky, founder of Airbnb, one of the founders. He mentioned that when, who would have imagined some years back that normal people will actually go into a stranger's home, let alone sleep in a stranger's bed. But Airbnb did it, right? And they called it designing for trust.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that? And what kind of behavior science practices, attributes, characteristics would have come into play when you do this?
So trust is something which you have to earn over time, I think. Or you have to build, in the case of Airbnb, enough of a reputation around your brand and enough of a structure around conflict resolution that people can trust that based on your background, your track record, it's a safe bet going with that company. And if things go wrong, there's a way to get things resolved. So it's kind of either you have to build it up with the individual in relationship, you build trust over time, or with a company, it has to be kind of the halo effect. You trust the company, and then everything else that they're connected with benefits from that. So one of the things I think is absolutely fundamental to trust, which is a foundation to happy and thriving relationships, is integrity, and being able to show that you are going to basically put your money where your mouth is. And so in the book, I kind of created a framework that I find is really just easy and helpful to think about what are the things that need to be in place in order to be able to conduct yourself with integrity in order to build trust. And so I think of it in terms of the 4 C's framework. So you have a commitment. So a commitment to certain values that are enacted in codes of conduct, in principles that you espouse. So making sure that you're explicit to certain values, that you're committing to them. The second C is making sure that you're congruent in word and deed. So walking the talk, making sure that you're acting in alignment with the words of, these are the values we care about, this is how we're going to enact them. So congruence in word and deed. The third C is about consistency over time. And that is about building that evidence base, the track record, so that when something goes wrong, which, in human systems, something inevitably does, people can look at it in the scope of your background and say, okay, well, maybe this is a mistake because this person or this brand has shown that they do over time have a commitment to these things. That's consistency over time. And finally, coherence in intention and behavior. And this is a bit more tricky to show up for, but it's basically doing the right thing for the right reason. So having your heart in the right place. And we can judge by and large when people are doing this. You can tell when someone is doing, a particular action or claiming something in a performative way, in a virtue signaling way, in a way that they're responding to an immediate trend, to social pressure or to legislative pressure. Is really different when you have a company or an individual who says, I'm going to stand up for this because I believe in it wholeheartedly. And often that entails taking a personal sacrifice. So I think those are the ways in which to build trust. Focus on integrity, commit to values, be congruent in word and deed, be consistent over time, and be coherent in intention and behavior. Think about that, and then that can help you kind of navigate that quite difficult territory with a bit of greater ease.
I like the 4 C's framework. Yeah. It's like, we use what is called a 5C model. Content, context, conduit is converts to customer and commerce, so I think it's easy, it's easy to remember, actually, just like they say the new 5 P's of marketing are very different from what Kotler suggested some years ago.
Yeah.
So do you see brand purpose has gone beyond the corporate governance fashion statement stage?
Yeah. I think it's a funny one, isn't it? Because a lot of people, and we always like to think whatever moment we're in that we're on the cutting edge. And I think that when people were talking about corporate social responsibility, that was then the cutting edge. And it was a sense of, for many people, perhaps with a more cynical hat on, it was a sense of companies being able to tack on a bit of social responsibility onto the side of the business. They'd get tax breaks, and it was really an adjunct to the business. It's something separate. With environmental, social, and governance protocols at ESG, it feels like it's kind of shifted its locus from the outside of businesses to really to the heart. It's like, well, what are we doing within the structure of the organization to make sure that we are taking responsibility for environmental impact? What are we doing from a social perspective, from a DE&I perspective, from a governance perspective? And I think that doesn't go far enough. So then it's a question of conversations that I'm sure you're hearing as well on your podcast around meaning and purpose and eudaimonic culture. So looking at sort of eudaimonia as the idea of the kind of quality of happiness through integrity and fulfillment and the sort of quest for self-actualization, which we don't necessarily fully achieve, but we move towards. So I think when we're thinking about brand purpose and the ways in which we spend so much time at work, and especially now the issues of retention and attraction of talent, what are the things that are going to give brands and businesses a greater ability to have success in the long term and to attract people and to retain retain people is not just going to be a good ESG strategy. It's got to be deeper than that. You've got to do well for the environment, for social endeavors, for the community around you, and give people a reason to want to show up for work and not just go for the paycheck. So it's about that intrinsic motivation. So it's a very interesting, very rich topic at the moment because there's so many factors at play.
Absolutely. In fact, just to extend that, I've written a piece for one of the newspapers here, and it's coming out next week. It started from the flavor of the season, the Great Resignation, and what organizations and brands need to be doing. So it is actually a beginning with building a culture, and then recognition, and therefore retention. Because I think, absolutely. So I think you're right. It is gaining prominence. It is going beyond water cooler discussions. I think it's coming into, mainstream thought leaders and senior leaderships and the C-suites. So I think we will see, it is going to be a marathon, Herculean effort, but as long as it stays within the ecosphere, I think we'll definitely keep moving and making progress,
that point that you make about culture is absolutely key. Because I think one of the things that we've seen, a conversation I've been having at length with someone who's become a friend of mine who I really admire, Dr. Naima Pasha, who's head of the future of work at Henley Business School. She's brilliant. Last year, 2020 or 2019, no, last year, she published a really fascinating paper, which is having a lot of impact in the world of business, called The Equity Effect. And it speaks to culture. And in the research that she conducted, she found that from one aspect of culture, which looks at race, she found that companies that had good DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion practices outperformed their competing companies by 58%. And of course, going back to this point of doing things for the right reason, you shouldn't have to convince a company or people in leadership to be diverse and to be supporting people to come and do their best work and be their best selves. For me, that's a no-brainer. But it's also good to have other ways of persuading. And so her work there looks principally at culture and how we can generate cultures that are welcoming of everyone. Because if we all feel welcome, we're going to do better, we're going to feel better, we'll have that sense of belonging. And that's where the magic happens. So I think there's a lot more receptivity to looking at what you say, looking at the culture from the inside out and doing that marathon commitment to say, this is not an easy slap it on the wall as a mission statement fix. This is going to be a long and hard road, and it's so worth it. So it's exciting to hear you talking about culture, because I think it's absolutely vital.
It is no longer an adage now, isn't it? Once upon a time, there used to be this adage, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Right, I think it's up front and center. And I think, things like psychological safety, the hippo factor, highest paid person in the room, all that are coming, and I think people are realizing the kind of folly and the anomalies that are all associated with it, right? Isn't it? Lovely. I want to talk about, and again, I think your space is so beautiful, Nathalie. Purpose, resilience, values, meaning, and talk about values. I think you launched this tool called the Values Map. Right, with Dr. Kiki Lutna, I hope I got the pronunciation right, of Goldsmiths University. Tell us what is the thought behind it, the inspiration behind it, and please feel free, go ahead.
Thanks for asking me and for plugging this tool. So one of the things that I find interesting as a challenge is finding routes for people to understand how to apply the principles that I write about. Because a lot of it, you can say, okay, values, it's great. Everyone has a sense of what values are, but it can actually be quite difficult to figure out, well, what really are my values within the context of business in this instance with the book? And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if we can devise something which is free, because I make my money through consultancy and through speaking, so it's nice to be able to gift something back that people can use. So something that's free, that's robust, that's based on sound psychological research, that's easy to use, and that helps people to identify what values they care about, to be able to see that mapped out, to be able to communicate them with greater clarity, and to see what it means in terms of, well, what does this show up with in terms of application to our communication, or application to our marketing, or to our corporate culture. So it's really a tool to help people identify, communicate, and enact their values. And it's based on Dr. Shalom Schwartz's basic theory of human values, which is fascinating as a model. So if you want to dive into it, obviously I go into it in more detail in the book, but this tool will help you basically apply the insights from that body of work and come out with actionable principles and advice and feedback on other businesses and brands that are in your space that share similar values, or get an archetype, which is kind of just a fun way to make it a bit more memorable. But also the juicy stuff is all the details on how to enact these things and what it means for you. So yeah, identifying and enacting your values in a very clear and hopefully structured way.
Lovely, lovely. So, brand resilience, again, I think we're in an era where both human and brand resilience are needed. For brand resilience, which are the three musketeers that are top of your list? What are the three things that brand should be looking for to build a really, really solid resilience, considering the dynamism and the ever chaotic kind of ecosphere that we are in currently?
So I think the first one is talking about what we've just touched on. So identifying, enacting, and communicating the psychological values that your business represents. And that's for several reasons. One is so that you have a sense of anchoring, so you know what you're showing up for, what change you're making in the world, and also for the partners that you pair with, for the broader ecosystem, and for the customers. So we know from research, this similarity attraction hypothesis or social identity theory, that we tend to flock to similar individuals, brands, and entities. So those people or entities that share our values, share our outlook, we're more likely to want to connect to them. So if you understand what your values are and you express them, you'll get more of that direct connection. The second one, of course, is living up to your integrity, to your values, which comes through the 4 C's framework to build trust. And finally, a third one, which you've not yet touched on, is giving your employees, partners, and customers greater self-determination. This is absolutely fundamental. Self-determination is a set of drives and psychological needs that are universal and they're innate. And if we meet them over the course of our lifetimes, we get a sense of greater flourishing and well-being. So this means giving people a greater sense of autonomy, so agency, volition, giving them more choice in terms of how they conduct themselves. It means giving them a greater sense of competence or skills to achieve the goals that are meaningful to them. And the third one is about relatedness, giving people a sense of belonging. And so I think if you can manage those things, doing the autonomy piece, competence, and relatedness under the bracket of self-determination, that also really helps. So values, integrity, self-determination.
Lovely. So especially over the last couple of years, can you name some of the brands and organizations that have really, really walked the walk on purpose and resilience?
Sure. Yeah, so there's 2 that I wanted to share with you, which I write about in the book, but which I find really exciting. So the first one is Gravity Payments. And the founder of Gravity Payments, Dan Price, they're based in Seattle, is a really outspoken advocate for better business. And what's interesting is that he, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, raised his company's minimum wage to $70,000 US. I think it was US dollars. And Fox News basically said, well, this is a socialist, his employees are going to be on the breadline. This is going to be a great case study in Harvard Business Review Harvard Business School about how not to run business. And he took a massive pay cut, to raise the company's minimum salary. He took $1 million pay cut, which was 90% of his salary, gave up his stocks and savings, and actually mortgaged both of his houses. And so since that time, when he took the pay cut and he raised the minimum wage, their revenue has tripled. They are a Harvard Business School case study.
For the right reason.
For the right reasons. Yes. So basically saying, this is how you retain clients. This is how you retain employees, and then also clients. And also in his, it means that in his cohort of employees, many of them have been able to buy their houses, move closer into town. They can actually take rest, which means they have a greater sense of well-being. They're burning out less, taking less sick leave, performance has gone up, intrinsic motivation has gone up. And it meant that crucially, and you asked about the pandemic, because they were able to generate, because he kind of sacrificed himself and was able to generate support financially and emotionally and from a purpose perspective for his employees, when the crisis hit and they were literally, losing $30,000 a day, 50% of their revenue was slashed out, and they were going to be out of cash in 5 months. The majority of their employees who came together to figure out a path forward actually volunteered to take a temporary cut in their salaries to protect the company. So within 24 hours, the majority of his staff had pledged $400,000, which is about 20% of their total payroll, and offered to give up 10 to 100% of their wages over the following month to keep the business going. So the sacrifice that he made to support his employees paid off dividends when the crisis hit and they were going to have to shut doors if they weren't able to find a route forward. And so I think that is such a beautiful example of what can happen when you reorient your decision making, not just for profit, but also how can we lift one another up and think about collective good, not making it socialist, not making it communist. There's still competition, but there's fundamentally a greater focus on collaboration and being stronger together and creating a resilient system, not just winner takes all. So I think that for me was such a powerful example that continues to be a great example. And another is Bloom and Wild, which is a UK-based digital florist. And they send out beautiful flowers in the mail, and I've used them for many years. And in 2019,
is that the one with the
Day,
Mother's Day example?
Yes, that's the Mother's Day. And it's such a good, simple example, right? So they had received a handful of messages from people, from customers saying, please don't send me Mother's Day
That's so beautiful,
communication. Yeah. Because, some people have lost their mothers. Some people don't have mothers. Some people have very fraught relationships. So they got this response from some people, and they thought, okay, rather than just unsubscribe these individuals, we are going to reach out to our entire database, which I think was, don't know how many people, it was a huge, thousands, tens of thousands, to say, if you want to opt out because Mother's Day can be difficult for some of us, just let us know and we'll opt you out. And this was a simple email that they sent out. It wasn't a fancy, expensive kind of PR campaign. It was just an email. And they got such a massive response. 18,000 customers opted out of specific Mother's Day messages. And 1,500 people got in touch about the campaign, on phone, via email, via Instagram, Twitter, to say how touched they were that they were given the option, given the agency back to self-determination, given the agency to make that choice. And because it was such a popular response, or because the campaign had such success, it got picked up by national papers, and Bloom and Wild decided to create what's called the thoughtful marketing movement, where they give greater agency back to their customers. So again, it's a sense of thinking back to the beginning of our conversation with behavioral science. How can you use behavioral science principles to facilitate and steward a great experience? And this means listening to your customers and being able to say to them, you have control now, you tell us what you need, we're going to give you greater agency. So that's another example where just that one single thoughtful response gave way to something much richer and to an approach which now more people are starting to see the value of.
Absolutely. I think, if I'm right, Lush Cosmetics decided to get out of social media for about a year, keeping in view, because digital natives and millennials on Instagram seeing pictures, and obviously there is FOMO and status anxiety and comparison. So, and it is causing a lot of mental health issues. So they took a collective decision of pulling out for about a year, and probably in the process, because it is such a good act, it is so counterintuitive. I think they've got millions of dollars of publicity, right from the topmost New York Times to Fortune and whatever it is, So, doing good is doing great for brands, going back to that, it is very circular. It is very circular, Lovely, lovely. Before we close out, I want to ask you, Nathalie, what is the books and people that have inspired you, over the years?
So I've written a list because there are so many people, but I'm going to give you a few. One of the areas that I find a lot of meaning in is looking at the ways in which ecology and human systems and wisdom traditions intersect. And so one of the most beautiful books that I absolutely love that's kind of transformed my way of thinking about this was a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which has become very popular, by an extraordinary botanist and member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her name is Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's an amazing writer, an amazing thinker, and she blends indigenous wisdom with scientific, like Western scientific practices and frameworks to understand our relationship with plants and what we can learn from them. So that one, Braiding Sweetgrass, is one of my all-time favorites. More recently, two people that have been really influencing my thinking and opening up new doors, is Rob Hopkins. He is the founder and figurehead of the transition movement, which he initiated back in 2005. And he wrote a brilliant book a couple of years ago called From What Is to What If. And it looks at ways in which we can enhance and harness and unleash our creative and imagination possibilities. Like, how do you educate children, or how do you engage people who are coming out of prison, or how do you help people who have mental health needs in a way that is creative and that draws upon the imagination to think of more regenerative paths forward. So his book, From What Is to What If, is a game changer. Definitely read it. And finally, the book that I've just finished reading by Anthea Lawson, who is a campaigner who's worked for Global Witness and Amnesty and many others. She wrote a fantastic book called The Entangled Activist. And I don't consider myself an activist at all, which is probably why it was such an interesting thing to have gifted to me. But this book looks beautifully at the different ways in which we're enmeshed and entangled with the systems that we're trying to change. So whether that's systems around, domination and extraction economies, what's an alternative to that? Looking at coloniality. So when we're thinking about race conversations, when we're thinking about gender conversations, ability and ages, all of these different things which hold us back in different ways, thinking about ways in which to give greater agency to people that we might want to help, and looking at the reasons why we are engaging in trying to help in the first place. So it's a really systemic approach. In fact, all of these books are much more systemic lenses onto how to unpick and understand the complexity of the systems within which we're enmeshed and which we contribute to, ways to unlock other ways of moving forward, what alternative systems could we help to create, and what kind of flourishing future do we want to envision and then work towards for each of us in our lives as individuals and within our wider communities. So that's really what's influencing my thinking at the moment. So yeah, check those guys out.
Lovely. One of the books that I recently came across, which is still, work in progress, which I found fascinating and beyond inspiration, was Matthew Barzan's The Power of Giving Away Power.
Oh, interesting. That sounds so good. I'm gonna have to check that out.
I'll send you the, the link, or, I will send it to you. It's absolutely inspiring. I've just about started reading it, The Power of Giving Away Power. And a lot of it is also inspired from Stoicism and, the Greek philosophers. And, it's beautiful. It's absolutely, and of course, the Viktor Frankls of the world. There are multiple, actually, yeah. I think, also probably, the way I look at it is that, is there any way we can inspire the coming generation, whichever way they want to consume it, to read more? Okay, because it's a challenge that multiple academia and other institutions are having, parents are having with kids. And, I think what is the way in which we can bring back the magic of storytelling, reading, consuming, debating, conversing, so because I think the other aspects of things like DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion will then look after itself, I feel.
They're so interconnected.
It's so interconnected.
It's interesting.
Exactly.
And then you're talking about storytelling. This is kind of we're going into sort of the mythic realms here, but which is another area that I'm very interested in, is, folk stories, folk music, storytelling, poetry. How do we tell new stories for our time about other things that are possible? Whether it's stories that put people at the heart of them that are not used to being at the center. So for instance, I notice with a lot of my male friends, a consciousness around, when they're talking about leaders, using the word she and he and they to make sure that there's, you're dropping it into the language. And it's a beautiful, subtle, but powerful way to change the ways in which, or to also to challenge our assumptions, but to change the ways in which we talk about one another. And I think that, how do we use language and story to create a different vision of what's possible, and one that isn't just dystopian, because we're living in such an ambient state, many of us, of anxiety and stress. And this is for those of us who are lucky enough to be in wealthy nations, in democratic nations, economically fairly sound. Most of the world doesn't live in that. So there is obviously a question around how do we, with that position of fortune and luck, that's also stemming from systemic injustices. We have to look at that as well. But how do we weave new, more representative stories that bring people into the mix, that gives power to everyone? And I love what you talk about, giving away power. We have to think more reflexively about this. Like, we need a different way forward, and we're only going to get through things well if we're able to work together. And this means having all of the opinions around the table and some way of bringing people into conversation. Yeah, I don't know. This is we could have a whole other conversation about this.
Absolutely, we'll do that. Let's do that. Actually, it's so interesting. I think you are very, very passionate and immersed in that space. I can see and sense. So beautiful. Thank you so much for the conversation. We'll stay in touch, and I'll hope to see you soon. I'll just conclude by stopping here, and then we can carry on with our conversation. Thanks so much.